The imagination of Hollywood, after 1947 is fascinating. I mean, with regard to the mystery of the flying saucers. I mean, 1947, of course, we had that was basically the starting point for the sightings for the ever since we've been people have been seeing UFOs, flying saucers, all kinds of strange objects, and then in the 60s there were reports of abductions started to come in, and went on through the 70s and 80s. And this thing has, there's been cattle mutilations starting, since the late 60s into the 70s into the 80s. It's a lot of mysteries surrounding these mysterious craft. But when the thing first cropped up back in 1947, it took a few years, but then Hollywood got on the bandwagon and we got all sorts of different interpretations of what might be piloting these craft. And, were any of those movies that came out in the 1950s, did any of them come close to what we now believe? Did the descriptions, did the characteristics of the creatures in any of those movies come anywhere close to what we now know and what we accept as what these beings look like? Most notably the Greys. There's some reptilian kind of creatures, insectoid style creatures, and of course there's Nordics. There's different kinds that have been reported, but most largely it's been the Greys. But in the 1950s, before there was any reports of alien abduction, people, Hollywood, came up with their own interpretations. And if starting in the early 1950s, in 1951, there were two movies that came out, and they couldn't be more different than one another. One was called The Thing from Another World, and the other one was called The Day the Earth Stood Still. In The Thing from Another World, the being was some sort of, it was humanoid in shape, but in physiology, it was a vegetable. It had the ability to reproduce itself with seed pods, in its being. It could plant seed pods, and it lived on blood. And it started becoming clear. The movie it takes place in the Arctic, where some scientists and Air Force personnel discover this crashed saucer, and they try to melt it out, but the thing blows up. But there's a being that survives. It must have been thrown clear somehow. So they bring it back in a big block of ice, and the thing thaws out, and it comes to life. And then it proceeds to start killing the people at this base, and using their blood to try to grow new ones, basically. And basically, it was trying to conquer. It becomes clear before the end of the movie that this thing showed up here to conquer the world and take over. But I'm not gonna. If you put it this way, if you have not seen any of these movies and you want to watch some of these movies, maybe you better not listen to this podcast, because I'm going to go through a few of them, some of the more known ones, the more memorable ones. There was a lot of low budget jobs out there too, but I'll go through some of the familiar ones here. But The Thing from Another World, does get destroyed in the end, in the final minutes, and the world is saved. On the flip side was The Day the Earth Stood Still, where an alien being shows up, and it's a guy, looks just like we do. But he has a big robot with him that's capable of destroying the whole planet. But he's not there for destruction. He's there to give us a warning that, hey, we better stop. Stop with this nuclear nonsense that we started back in 45, or all the alien races out there are going to come and blow us up. But it was more of a message of peace. They wanted to save us. This guy wanted to save us, whereas the thing wanted to conquer us and destroy us and take over the world. So that's how it proceeded throughout the 50s. Most of the movies were evil beings from space with bad intentions. But some of them were, sometimes they were indifferent. In the case of the 1953 film, It Came from Outer Space, which was probably the first big science fiction movie to be released in 3D. And it's a great movie. However, there was in that movie, this alien spaceship crash lands on Earth. And then we find out later that they weren't planning on going to Earth. They were on a different. They're studying life throughout the galaxy, and they happen to crash land on Earth. And they're trying to fix their ship as quick as possible because they're afraid that the humans there just won't understand them and might destroy them. But the beings there, they look nothing like humans. I mean, they look like these gelatinous blobs with one big eye in the middle of their head. But they did have the ability to change their form to look like humans. But if you saw what they really look like, I mean, they're horrible. They they look like nothing on Earth. I mean, they're monstrous looking. But nothing. The movie ends up. I don't think any humans get killed in that. A couple of the aliens get killed because of, some humans. But other than that, they were there. It was an indifferent kind of thing. They were just there. They're trying to repair their ship so they can get out of there because they didn't want to deal with humans because they knew humans weren't ready for to communicate with aliens yet. And then another movie, The War of the Worlds, which was based on H.G. Wells' novel from the 1800s, but it was updated to take place in the 1950s. Those beings were. They came to destroy, basically. They're Martians, and they came to completely take over Earth and destroy it and get rid of us, and they're blowing everything up. But they ended up succumbing to the bacteria that we have on Earth. Their bodies weren't prepared for that. But they looked nothing like the Greys. They were short, little, stumpy, slimy things with suction cups at the end of their fingers. They only had like 3 or 4 fingers. They looked nothing like what we now know as the Greys. And then there was other movies. The Crawling Eye from 1958. In that movie, there were aliens that had landed on top of. They were landing on top of mountaintops in different parts of the world. Basically, they could only live in cold, but they basically looked like a tentacled octopus type creatures with one big giant eye in the middle of their head, and they're basically involved in some sort of acclimatization program to make the world a colder place so they could inhabit it and then take us over. They look nothing like the beings that we now know are the Greys or any of the other creatures that are alleged. But they're interesting looking, even though it was a lower budget type of movie, but it had a lower budget type of movie, but it did have a really good storyline to it. However, those beings look nothing like what we've now known. We've now accepted as what these beings, are coming here look like. There was another movie, Earth versus the Flying Saucers. That was from 1956. Those beings, they were humanoid. They're probably closer to. They wore this complete metal suit with a metal helmet that completely covered their heads, and then there was one scene where they take the helmet off, and they look human somewhat, with the heads that are a little bit larger for their body, but they looked like old, wrinkly type, dark-skinned kind of beings. But they don't really look like they didn't look like what we've known. We've come to know as the most popular invader in the reality of the situation as the Greys. 1953, there was another movie called Invaders from Mars. Very scary movie, especially if you're a kid and you watch this one, where these Martians again show up, and most of these things look like really they're like tall, bug-eyed looking, look like people wearing like look like a bunch of guys wearing a suit, basically, with three big fingers on each hand, and big bug eyes. Looked nothing like what we've known. However, there was the leader of these things that had a big. It was contained inside of like a glass orb. It had a big head similar to what we say the Gray. So that one came came pretty close to what we've known. Not quite. I mean, if you see this thing, I mean, it's completely ridiculous and fantastic. But hey, the head anyway comes close to what we've come to know. There was another movie called Invasion of the Saucermen, which was a low budget job from the late 50s, and there was like little green men, basically, like the cliche, and these things, I guess, in their form, they look something like what we've come to know as the Greys, but they look nothing like what the Greys look. They look demonish, like demons, like devilish, and they were pretty much out to conquer. Again, most of these things from the 50s were bad. There was another movie, a big production called This Island Earth from 1955, and in that film, there were beings that looked very similar to humans. They all had like white hair and big foreheads. They're protruding foreheads, much more intelligent than we are. And basically, we find out that they're here because they're trying to develop new forms of atomic energy because they're in a battle with some other planet back on their home planet, and they're running out of resources, so they're here. They come to our planet to try to get our scientists to help them, and then they kidnap some of them and bring them back. And I mean, they weren't friendly. I mean, for the most part, there was one friendly one, but the rest of them they didn't care if the Earth was this. They were going to take over the Earth. They're going to leave their planet and come to Earth and basically make us their slaves. So no, they were bad, but they were smart. And I guess maybe they're probably closer to what we now know as the Nordics. But let's see, what else has there been over the course of the 50s. There was I Married a Monster from Outer Space from 1958, where basically these horrible-looking, monstrous-looking aliens come to Earth because their race is dying, and they need women to procreate, Earth women to procreate. So they end up kidnapping married men, and then taking their forms, and then living with the women with the idea that they're gonna make babies together. It actually sounds better. The movie's actually better than what it sounds like. It's actually a pretty good one. But again, those beings look nothing like what we've known to accept as reality in the world of alien invaders. Of course, there's The Blob. That was the movie, Steve McQueen's first big hit, actually, the late Steve McQueen. And in that movie, there's this meteorite that crash lands near this small town, and there's this old guy who's living in a shack in the woods who goes out and investigate, and he pokes this little meteorite with a stick. Next thing you know, it breaks open, and there's this gelatinous mass inside there, and he gets it on his stick, and he picks it up, and the thing gets on his hand, and basically over time it absorbs him, and it keeps absorbing more people, and getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And basically this thing is, if it's not stopped, it's going to take over the world. Now, we know nothing of creatures like that. And hopefully we never do. That would be very, very scary if there was an actual blob, rolling around the planet, just absorbing everything every living thing in its path and getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Really, the only way to fight it was with cold. But yeah, that's a good one. But again, nothing like what we know is coming here. Thank God. There was the original Invasion of the Body Snatchers from 1956 also, But these things were just seed pods that came out of space, landed on Earth, and basically each pod turned into, if one of these things seeds gets near you, then it turns into a likeness of you, and then your body disintegrates, and then they take you over, and it's basically some sort of a, I guess you could look at that as similar to the hybridization program, but yeah, but actually that's really, really far fetched, that the idea of seed pods coming from space and taking on the form of human beings and taking them over and replacing them, basically. It's this very scary movie, though, however. One of the scariest from the 50s. And there were some other, some really low-budget jobs that are even, some of them aren't really worth mentioning, like Plan 9 from Outer Space. It's a shame that a movie like that is popular because it's absolute garbage. However, in addition to Invaders from Space, of course, a lot of movies from the 50s involved giant insects, growing large a lot of times from atomic energy, like Them. That was giant ants. And then there was Tarantula, of course, a giant tarantula. There are some of the good ones. And then there was some other movies like Beginning of the End that featured giant grasshoppers. There was the giant leeches. I mean, there was all kinds of movies with giant bugs, and that some of them were good, some of them were bad. But again, we're getting off the point here. The 50s did feature a lot of science fiction movies that had invaders from space. And the ones I've mentioned are probably the most well-known ones, the better ones. And then there were some that were not that good, but none of them basically, they had good the imaginations behind these movies were great. If you ever see any of these movies, you'll think, these are pretty good. However, they didn't. Nobody guessed what these beings really looked like. It would have been interesting, I guess. Like say you were in Roswell in 1947 and you saw what these beings look like. You were one of the lucky people that got to see what these aliens looked like. It would have been interesting if you're sitting in a movie theater a few years later and you're watching things like It Came from Outer Space or Invaders from Mars, and you're thinking, well, I really know what they look like. Or you're somebody in the government who got a chance to see it and knows for a fact that there's things here coming here from other places, and you see what Hollywood's dreaming up, and it would have been interesting, I guess. And I guess it's interesting for people today when they watch movies. The people that are in on the secret, that know, that actually had their actual eyeballs looking at actual beings from other worlds, their bodies recovered in crashes or whatnot. Because we know there's people out there that are like that. There are some people blessed with this knowledge that are governments of the world or have refused to share with the general public. And they probably look at some of these things and probably chuckle and think, well, they don't really know what they really look like. Boy, I know what they really look like. I guess it's, interesting. It would be interesting to be one of those people. I'd like to see actual pictures of the beings that were recovered from the Roswell crash. Apparently they seemed a little bit different than the large-headed grays that we've come to know from, years later. I mean, if you see the drawings of the Roswell beings, they're a little bit different. They look like basically little people with 4 fingers only on their hands, though. Their heads are bigger. When you look at some of the drawings, like the late Glenn Dennis provided, the mortician that famous story, he met with that nurse, and she provided a picture on a napkin, and he drew it the way he remembered it. It looked more like, it didn't look like your traditional gray. It looked somewhat different. The grays are a little bit scarier looking than what the Roswell beings looked like. So that's why I always believe there's multiple different kinds of beings coming here and checking us out. But yeah, if you ever get a chance to watch any 50s movies with the alien invaders in it, do so. It's very interesting. Those movies are a lot of fun. And I always enjoy watching them. However, they are removed from reality. I mean, as time went on, we understand that, yeah, there are things coming here, but they're nothing apparently like what we see in these movies. But the movies are fun to watch.